Do you know what that means?
I don't know why they invoked it there.
Right. And so I take it when you were having this phone call, there was no one else present on the phone other than you and Ms. Jackson, was there?
I don't believe that this is a phone call any longer.
Well, if we scroll back up, this is the second page. It's
Yes,
the way it's
the
ordered.
flag to Katie at the top.
Flag to Katie, okay. And so on February 10th, do you remember if Ms. Jackson was in a meeting with Cabinet?
She is not normally in meetings with Cabinet.
So how could Section 39 is a Cabinet confidence? So how can, this is the problem. Those are my questions.
Thank you. If we could now call on the Ottawa Police Service, please.
Good evening. My name is David Michikowski. I'm a lawyer for Ottawa Police Service. Ms. Telford, my questions, at least initially, will be directed to you. I understand that the PMO relies on the RCMP.
Generally? What do you mean?
Well, I guess the PMO relies on the RCMP to protect the Prime Minister and others.
Yes.
And you trust the RCMP?
You do?
The RCMP has kept the Prime Minister and his family safe.
They have?
And the RCMP takes security very seriously.
They do?
And one of the documents, I won't take you to it, but I believe the Commission took you to it. One of the documents that you were taken to reference the Intersect group. You're familiar with the Intersect group?
Can you remind me?
Sure. It was described in that document as a group that gets stood up and is composed of the OPS, the RCMP, PPS, OPP. You're familiar with that?
Yes.
And all of them are involved in decisions and discussions about these types of protest events and security concerns, correct?
That sounds right.
And in fact, in that chain of emails that you were taken to, there's reference, and it was on January 25th, Ms. Powers indicates that the key will be tomorrow's Intersect meeting and how law enforcement will pre-mobilize. So you're obviously aware that the RCMP, whom you have a lot of confidence in, is monitoring the protest as it's approaching Ottawa, correct?
Yes.
And on January 27th, and I won't pull it up, but I'll give the reference for the record. It's pb.can401844. There's a series of text messages, I believe, between Minister Mendocino and yourself, and you indicate that the RCMP, or he indicates to you that the RCMP on January 27th says that the current estimate is about 2,700 trucks, but the numbers could fluctuate. Do you recall that?
That sounds right.
And there's another document from the PMO, I believe it's from Ms. Power. She's the issues advisor.
She's one of several issues advisor, but she holds the file for public safety.
And so there's an email from her on January 28th. Again, the reference number is ssm.can.nsc402795. And she gives some more data as to what the status is. One of the things that she references in that report on the latest numbers is Project Hendon. And we've heard a lot about Project Hendon. Was that something that you were familiar with as well?
Not at the time.
I'm sorry?
Not at the time.
Okay. Subsequently, you did hear about Project Hendon, is that right?
During the inquiry, I've heard a fair bit
Right.
about it.
And so she's referring to, so obviously the RCMP, I'm assuming, has access to the same Hendon data as the other security services. Fair assumption?
I couldn't speak to what information they had access to.
Okay. And so what we see when we look at all of these documents that I'm referring to is the numbers of vehicles, of trucks in the convoy in the last couple days before it arrives is a constantly fluctuating number. Nobody seems to be able to get a full grasp on it. Is that fair?
It certainly felt that way.
And certainly nobody, even the RCMP, up until that day, the Friday, were saying that this protest was going to become an occupation, correct?
I will say in those updates that were coming from Mary Liz Power, and they were more than once daily by the end of the week, there were some references, and I do believe this commission has seen in those emails, and I think it was attributed to Op Intersect, that this could be a prolonged demonstration. But you are right, there was a lot of uncertainty about what was coming.
And so you understood that even the law enforcement community couldn't predict exactly what occurred and what did in fact occur. Fair?
I agree this was a challenging situation for everyone.
And you wouldn't fault the RCMP for that, would you?
No.
You've talked about what you saw on social media in the days leading up to it, and CSIS has told us that analyzing social media is rather complex and requires more than simply scrolling through social media. You wouldn't have any reason to disagree with that, would you?
I think it's a fair statement, but there are some things said on social media that represent clearly the views of the person expressing it. And in this case, in this demonstration, there were statements made on social media about threats of violence, threats to individuals, and aims and motives that they had for this
I'm sorry, I don't
demonstration.
mean to cut you off, but I have a very limited amount of time. My question was more related to the numbers of people that are coming on social media, because what Mr. Vigneault said is it is difficult to tell. It's a challenge, I think he said, to know when someone moves from the online space to physical space, and the social media is full of misinformation. Ms. Telford, you wouldn't disagree with that, would you?
I think it was challenging for everyone, and that's why it was important to bring everyone together at various points. But I do think there was, I think a number of people, including Mr. Vigneault, have spoken about how figuring out the social media space is something that needs to be done coming out of this.
Right. And you recognize, just moving on to another area, you recognize that police, and we've heard from a number of ministers, that police need to have operational independence from government.
Absolutely.
And that police have to make operational decisions in real time for reasons that may not be evident to the government or to the public. Fair?
Of course, and that's something we took very, very seriously.
And again, you respected that operational independence. You wouldn't want the police, whether it's the Ottawa or OPP or the RCMP, to take action without considering what impact that action would have on officer safety or crowd safety or children in the crowd.
Of course.
And in fact, one of the lessons of Ipperwash that we've heard is that governments should not be allowed to influence specific law enforcement operational decisions. You'd agree with that? Fair?
Ipperwash was actually something I asked after, and we got a verbal brief on very early on. I think it was actually even before before it became even an occupation, because it was something we were very preoccupied about respecting.
And it's because decisions, those type of operational decisions, belong to the police based on their expertise and their discretion, correct?
Yes.
And there's nothing to suggest that the Ottawa Police Service did not exercise their discretion legitimately and in good faith in this case. Is that fair?
Fair.
The situation we've heard in Ottawa was, I'm going to use a word that we've all heard a lot in this, was a volatile one. You wouldn't disagree with that.
It was extremely volatile.
And ultimately, that situation was diffused. But you'd agree with me that diffusing a situation like this one is something that takes time. In fact, the Prime Minister, in a conversation with the Governor General on February 5th, specifically made that point when he said it's going to take time to diffuse this. You wouldn't disagree with that, would you?
I believe that conversation was a ways into the occupation already. So I don't think I can agree or disagree with whether or not these things always take time.
And ultimately, in addition to time, it took a massive amount of additional resources as well, correct?
It certainly did in this instance.
And those, let me just finish off my remaining minute or two. Negotiations, you understand that before police execute a tactical operation, they will try and diffuse a situation and try to negotiate, right?
These were things we were briefed on, yes.
And in fact, you'll recall that the Prime Minister and Minister Blair met with opposition leaders and provided a briefing on February 10th. And at that briefing, the National Security and Intelligence Advisor specifically said law enforcement activities are in line with negotiations with organizers to ensure there's no violence. That makes sense to you, doesn't it?
Yes.
And she also indicated that Minister Blair talked about the importance of negotiation by the police, and you wouldn't disagree with what Minister Blair said?
No, I believe this was the first call with the opposition leaders that was earlier on in the occupation. Is that right?
I'm not sure if it was the first or the second.
I'm pretty sure it was the first.
Now, we talked about the engagement proposal that was prepared as a framework for negotiation. And I understand that Deputy Minister Stewart on February 11th advised that that engagement proposal had been prepared and validated with the OPP expert, Marcel Baudin. Do you recall that?
I know he worked with somebody in the OPP.
And in fact, Chief Slowly had earlier on also requested an interlocutor be used as a method of achieving a breakthrough. You're aware of that?
I'm not sure.
And one of the rationales, and I'll just finish off this point, if I may, Commissioner, one of the rationales that you mentioned in your witness statement for why the engagement proposal went nowhere was what happened in Windsor. And when I looked at the record, there's an indication in a document that we'd seen previously. It's PBNSC.CAN 402963. Deputy Minister Stewart said that the reason the letter from Ontario Minister Jones didn't have much effect was owing to the late hour of the day in which it was given out and the enforcement starting the next morning. You wouldn't have any reason to disagree with that, would you?
I do believe that's what the Deputy Minister said.
Right. And after the engagement proposal was discarded as an idea, nobody went back to the police and said, or Marcel Baudin, and said, hey, what else should we do? Is that fair?
It wasn't discarded as an idea. There was nothing to act on. I do think those are different things.
Okay. Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Okay, thank you. If I could now ask for the CCLA, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Kara Zwiebel. I'm counsel for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Mr. Commissioner, my friend Mr. Honor from the Democracy Fund has given me 5 of his minutes, and he's going to limit his questioning to 5 minutes. So I have 15 now by my count.
Okay.
So I want to ask you about a theme that my friend Mr. Majakowski was just asking you about around sort of this question about the proper relationship between police and government. And I would imagine that as both, employees in the Prime Minister's office and obviously residents of Ottawa, it might be difficult to sort of separate the fact that you're looking at what's going on, both from a policy perspective, but also living through it. Right, you live here.
I don't.
Oh, you don't live here.
I live in Toronto.
Oh, okay. So some of you live here. Now, I know you have access to briefings from the RCMP. I'm not sure if you get briefings or sit in on briefings from any of the intelligence bodies. But I think we've seen some documents that also sort of show you doing a bit of your own, getting information, as we all do, from media sources, from social media. So for example, can we pull up SSM NSC CAN 402940? And I think, Ms. Telford, this is a text message between you and the Prime Minister. I think it's a tweet from a reporter. An admission police this is February 2nd, an admission police cannot control the situation. This is a complete mess and textbook mismanagement. They allowed the truckers to set up shop next to the PMO in West Block and where tens of thousands of people live, and now realize the problem they helped create. Unbelievable. And I think this is the Prime Minister writing to you. The PPS, I think that's Parliamentary Protective Service, RCMP guy in caucus said as much. He said he didn't want to let them onto Wellington, but it wasn't his call. So are you sharing this with the Prime Minister as just sort of, here's what's happening on the ground, here's what people are talking about, here's what's in the zeitgeist?
In a manner of speaking, you'll find throughout a lot of the texts that I submitted, a lot of different tweets, as well as information from the Prime Minister's executive assistant, who lived right in Centertown and was keeping him posted on what it was like on the ground.
Okay. And then can we also pull up SSM CAN 407729? I forget that they're also here, but I can't really see them. So over here, again, I think, can we just scroll down just a little bit? So this is Evan Solomon. Just walked through the protest on Parliament Hill tonight, and I spoke to two guys carrying fuel containers past police. The police chief said protesters would not be allowed to bring fuel to, I think that's trucks, but these two said police aren't bothering them at all, no enforcement. And I think this is you. Sorry, can we scroll up? Was this one of your texts, Ms.
No, it's not
Okay.
actually. So what you can't see there is that also in this chat is the Prime Minister's executive assistant, or was executive assistant at that time.
Okay.
And so that's an example of what I was just describing.
Okay. And can we scroll down? So saw this type of thing happen when I left Hill, gas coming in, and cops were just standing, looking at them walk by. We've heard evidence in the commission that at some point protesters started filling jerry cans with water as a bit of a tactic, so that it looked like the police weren't doing anything about gas being brought in, but in fact it was water. Is that something that you were aware of, or have you heard about that during the course of the commission?
I've heard a number of things to do with the jerry cans over the course of the commission.
Okay. Is it fair to say that what you were seeing both on social media and in the media and on the ground here in Ottawa as residents or part-time residents maybe, weren't sort of matching what you were hearing from the police, from briefings from the RCMP?
I think especially in the early days, there were a lot of different numbers coming from what we were seeing on social media, what we were seeing reported from mainstream media who were, walking around and doing their own counts, as well as what was coming in from different law enforcement agencies.
Okay. Can we go to, it's Mr. Clow's notes, SSM NSC CAN 402941. It's page 11 of the PDF. And if you can make it just a bit bigger. So I don't think we have a date on this, although I think based on where it's placed in the document, we're maybe, I think it's after the note that you identified, Mr. Clow, as being on February 9th. And
It's February 10th.
Okay, so February 10th. So this is, I think, is this the three of you? Or is this the other JB?
The other JB.
Okay, the other JB and the Prime Minister. KT will call clerk next. You're not being briefed by Intel officials. Someone on US side who can give best advice. Surely someone in system, someone played out plan. And I'm not sure what RCMP, Intel, Lucky, anyone else to report on this. So what is this? Can you tell me what this note means, not being briefed by Intel officials?
Yes. So that morning, so this was February 10th, there were a series of meetings that led up to the incident response group that happened later that day. So right before this note, a discussion happened between the Prime Minister and several ministers, including Minister Mendicino, Minister Blair, where he was updated and it went around the table, full discussion of the current situation. This discussion was a debrief of the Prime Minister and a few of us staff members coming out of that meeting. So you see some next steps. And I believe the comment about Intel was a reflection that we were absolutely getting a lot of information, particularly from the National Security Intelligence Advisor, but there was an interest in more of it. And there was still an incomplete picture when you looked at the various blockades and demonstrations across the country and what was behind it and what was going into it and where was it going.
Okay, so not a lack of intelligence, but not as much as you wanted. Is that fair?
Right.
Okay. In your witness summary, and I can bring it up if you'd like, but there's the lessons learned sort of section or a place where you're pointing out some areas that you hoped the commission could comment on. And one of the things you say there, the panel suggested that the commission provide further guidance on the independence of police operations. Mr. Broadhurst, so that's the other one who's not here, sorry, underscored that the government understands the importance of not dictating police operations. And at times it was difficult to know whether the police and the government shared the same ultimate goal. The government should be able to discuss a desired outcome, for example, to clear the occupation and blockades and share concerns about the consequences that the country would face if that does not happen. Did you, during the time that the blockades and occupation were happening, did you have doubts about whether the police planned to clear them?
I don't think it's a question of whether they planned to clear them, but that there were on multiple occasions where we were being briefed that things were going to happen that then didn't happen. So we found ourselves 3 weeks in with things continuing to escalate.
Okay, but you would say that you did believe that police and government had the same ultimate goal. There were frustrations and maybe mismatches in terms of timing, but was there a doubt in your mind that the police I know it sounds silly, but did you think that the police's plan was to just allow this to continue?
No, the concern was, do they have the tools, or is there more that could be done by the federal government, provinces, municipalities? Could we support them more? That was the discussion and concern.
Okay. And once the Emergencies Act was invoked, I've talked to this about some other witnesses, and I think they've agreed that although government can't direct police, one of the things that a public order emergency does is communicate very clearly to police that there are certain things that the government wants to happen, and they're giving them the tools to make those things happen. Do you agree with that? So in this case, the government wants the flow of funds to stop going to people that are funding the blockades.
Right.
And it's giving the RCMP and financial institutions the tools to make that happen?
The government, the cabinet, the prime minister wanted the unlawful activity and the threats to stop. And the Emergencies Act and the measures in it was the best assessment of what could be provided as additional tools to help the unlawful activity stop.
Okay. And once the Emergencies Act was in place and the orders were in place, I know the IRG continued to meet, and there was some tracking of the measures, of how the measures were working, right? There was an attempt to collect that information so that you could see what impact the orders were having. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. One other area I want to talk about, I understood your evidence on the engagement proposal and why that didn't go further, because there wasn't sort of a tangible plan there. I just wanted to ask you about a different aspect of this. And if we can pull up, it's, I hope I have it here. Yeah, SSM NSC CAN 50292. This is one of the, I think it's an SSE meeting notes. Sorry, let's just take a look. Yes, SSE, and it's from February 3rd. And if we can scroll, it would be probably, I think it's page 8. And Mr. Clerk, you might need to, oh, you don't have to rotate it. But if you can just move it over, yeah. So I just want to ask about these some of these creative alternatives on this side of the screen. One is Le Grand Débat, modeling after 2019 Yellow Jackets protest in France. The country launched a national listening exercise, cross-country meetings. French president attended some. Did that suggestion make it to the IRG or to cabinet? Was that something that was explored beyond this sheet of paper?
And sorry, what date was this from?
February 3rd, I believe.
February 3rd. So that was the first meeting of that cabinet committee. My assessment of this document is that it's a public service document, which is fairly normal for these discussions to fuel a discussion. I would say on that, I can't speak to what was discussed or whether that was addressed in the meeting, but I would say in February, there was a very specific, urgent need. And my view is that that would not have been appropriate to address that urgent national challenge that we were facing right in that moment.
Okay, and just if we can scroll down just a little bit, the last item there, communications shift. Encourage shift in communication. We hear you, we understand, go home. Question, does this legitimize protest? What about that discussion? Was there a discussion about, and I know we saw a text, a message that was communicated, I think, through Minister LeBlanc from Jason Kenney, saying, something about calling them all Nazis didn't help. I think here what someone's getting at is maybe we should tone down the rhetoric and try to, even if we're not going to meet with them, try to, in a communications way, tone it down. Was that something that was discussed or considered?
There were constantly discussions like that. Is there something we could say, something we could do? Just like there were lots of discussions about the engagement proposals. But the wall we would always hit is the assessment was, given the demands of the convoy, which was to drop all the mandates, we weren't going to get very far with this kind of suggestion.
Okay. Last thing I'm going to ask, I know I'm almost out of time. I just want to ask about, and if we could pull up, sorry, Mr. Clow's notes one last time. I think the clerk probably knows the number, yeah. And here it's page 23.
It's not almost, by the way.
Oh, okay. May I get one last one in?
Yes,
Thank
yes,
you.
you may.
So we're at February 14th, and maybe we can make it just a little bigger. Thank you. So February 14th, 12:30 p.m. I'm going to look on my paper here. PM taking, I think that's maybe
Taking time now, then it says he'll depart from the Hill to head to West Block.
Okay, and then Jagmeet Singh, opposition leader, can do it whenever. The part that I'm interested in is this discussion about Quebec. And, you know, I gather that, I'm not sure, I guess this is after the first minister's meeting. So we know that Quebec is a bit concerned about the application of the Emergencies Act in the province. And it says, without saying we're sending RCMP to Quebec, PM call a go, no intention to do anything in Quebec other than Ottawa. Pablo, I assume that's Minister Rodriguez, called to Legault. Military isn't a part of this, not looking to take over, won't go to Quebec border. So it seems if you don't need it, then we're not going there.
So this was a staff debrief following the FMM on that day, ahead of the Prime Minister's conversations with the opposition leaders. So at this time, the consideration was continuing around the Emergencies Act. So this was a quick discussion of staff of things we should be considering or doing coming out of the FMM. Given the Premier of Quebec communicated so clearly that he didn't want the act applied in Quebec, that's what that discussion reflects. It was a very brief staff discussion.
Okay, it wasn't ever communicated to the Premier of Quebec that the act wouldn't apply there or that the police wouldn't take action there, because that's not something that would have been possible given what the orders said.
Right, the act did apply there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for answering my questions. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Okay, thank you. The Democracy Fund, JCCF, please.
Good evening. My name's Alan Honor. I'm a lawyer from the Democracy Fund. I just have a few questions for you, and they're directed to anyone at the panel. You were asked about political commentary from the United States. If I recall correctly, that was something that President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau spoke about.
Yes.
Okay, and I just want to ask you about some of the political commentary which happened after the invocation of the Emergencies Act, and after the meeting with President Biden, which I understand to be February the 11th.
The phone call was February 11th, yes.
Pardon me?
Phone call was February 11th.
Yes, thank you. Can we pull up pb.can 6069 _ REL.0001? And this is a letter from Premier Kenney, Premier Moe, and 16 governors from the United States of America. And I believe it's dated February the 16th. And my friends and correct me if I misconstrue this letter, but the signatories here are expressing concern over vaccine requirements and the impacts of those requirements on the North American supply chain, the cost of living, and the availability of essential products for people from both countries. My question for you is, how does a letter like this get before the Prime Minister?
Could I see the signatories?
Yes, of course.
So in general, when correspondence comes in, especially at this moment, on this issue, given the Emergency Act was in place February 16th, letters get to him sometimes through a normal course. That may take some time. Other times, letters are elevated more urgently.
Okay. And this letter here, I assume it's important because we got 16 governors from the United States. It's our biggest trading partner, our best ally. Notably, it's signed by the governor of Montana. Of course, Montana is right across from Coutts, Alberta. Did this letter get to the Prime Minister? Do you know?
So I can't recall if this got to the Prime Minister, but I would say the views expressed match the views that we heard from a lot of people, but the government did not agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Can we pull up pb.can .401045 _ REL.0001? And the document we're going to see here, it's not dated, but the top words are congressional reaction, and it contains a number of tweets, including a tweet from Matt Rosendale. He's a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Montana. And this appears to be after the invocation of the Emergencies Act, and he says that he led 63 Republican colleagues in support of the truckers protesting COVID-19 mandates and urging President Joe Biden to work with Canada to lift the mandates on essential travel at the border. Do you know if this was ever brought to the Prime Minister's attention?
This specifically, I can't speak to that. I don't know if it was brought to his attention.
Okay, one more document, ssm.nsc.can 50172. And this is when it comes up, if I got the number right. Yes, so this is an email from Deputy Jacques Adam to Deputy Minister Jacques Adam to Deputy Minister David Morrison. I'm not sure if they're both from Global Affairs Canada, but the email sets out U.S. political reactions to Canadian measures. It's dated February the 16th. And if we can just look at item number 2 here, we see that there are different comments. One of the comments here is Canadian truckers being fired and now targeted as terrorists by your woke government. And it is attributed to a U.S. House of Representatives, a member. And there are other remarks from other politicians which are somewhat uncomplimentary towards our country. Do you know if this document was ever brought to the Prime Minister's attention?
I don't believe this document would. This looks like an internal document at the Department of Trade. But Prime Minister, we were all well aware that these views were being expressed by a certain segment in U.S. politics.
Okay, thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Thank you. And next, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Janani Shanmuganathan, and I am counsel for the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and my questions are for Ms. Telford. So we know that there were 3 IRG meetings that took place on February the 10th, the 12th, and the 13th. And while cabinet ministers were present at these meetings, it's not a meeting of the entire cabinet, right?
Correct.
And we do know that there was a meeting with the entire cabinet that took place the evening of February the 13th, right?
That's right.
And the following morning on February the 14th, there was a meeting with the first ministers. And then later that day on February the 14th, or at some point that day, there was a decision made to declare the public order emergency.
Later that day, that's right.
Thank you. And so I just have a few questions about cabinet meetings. Does the Prime Minister's office advise the Prime Minister on the agendas for cabinet meetings?
Usually the Privy Council office, led by the clerk, puts forward an agenda for a cabinet meeting. And actually, usually John's team here will go back and forth with them a bit on it in case there's any insight into, particularly into time management of the meeting. But they will present that to the Prime Minister.
Okay, so it's fair to say, though, that you have some input. The Prime Minister's office has some input into the agenda.
Input would be fair, yes.
All right. And who ultimately decides the agenda at cabinet meetings? Like, who has the final say?
The Prime Minister.
And does the Prime Minister's office advise the Prime Minister on which non-cabinet officials attend cabinet meetings?
No, not really. I mean, the clerk of the Privy Council would be the person who would advise and advise on officials in terms of who should attend. And then there's usually a few from the Prime Minister's office who attend, and the Prime Minister agrees with who those are.
Okay, so does the Prime Minister's office offer any input in terms of suggestions of who could or who should attend these meetings of non-cabinet members?
Only of our own team.
Okay, and who decides which non-cabinet officials attend these cabinet meetings?
I think I just said that, but I'll try again, so the clerk in terms of officials on the public service side. And ultimately, it's the Prime Minister who decides who he welcomes in the cabinet room. Clerk will advise and sign off on a list from an official's perspective, and then there's usually some representatives from the Prime Minister's office.
Okay, but the Prime Minister, I take it, has the final say of who attends.
Of course.
All right, and does the Prime Minister's office advise the Prime Minister on what information should be shared at these cabinet meetings?
Again, the Privy Council office, and so it's the clerk who will, and her teams, who will put together the information. And we may have some supplemental or additional information from a political perspective that we may provide in a briefing ahead of cabinet. But the documents come from the public service side.
Okay, so leaving aside the physical documents that are coming in, it's fair to say, though, that the Prime Minister's office has some input into the kinds of documents that are provided at the cabinet meetings.
Yes, I mean, we will provide feedback. Sometimes they'll ask us from the public service side what our thoughts are around, especially as it relates to meeting flow and what might be most useful, that kind of thing for the minister.
Okay, and I take it it's fair to say that it's, again, the Prime Minister who's got the ultimate say of the information that's provided at these cabinet meetings?
Yes.
And in terms of documents at the cabinet meetings, I take it you all, the Prime Minister's office also provides some input into the kinds of documents. I think I've already touched on this, the documents as well.
Yes.
Okay. And so in terms of the February 13th meeting, the evening meeting with the full cabinet, who sort of set the agenda for the cabinet meeting?
Same process as I just described.
Okay, and did the Prime Minister's office offer any input for the agenda for that February 13th evening cabinet meeting?
So things were moving very quickly that day, and we were on the brief ahead of the cabinet meeting. And so I imagine we probably added some thoughts in terms of how the meeting might flow, but that would have been the extent of it that day.
Okay, and what about the information that was provided at that February 13th evening cabinet meeting? Did the Prime Minister's office offer any input on the information that would be provided?
I'm not even sure if we would have at that time.
I don't recall doing that, no.
Okay, what about the documents at that February 13th evening meeting? Did the Prime Minister's office offer any input?
Sorry, I'm not sure I know the difference between the last one and this one. I thought we were just answering about documents. So same answer.
So information, it could be things that are said vocally out loud to the cabinet members versus physical documents that are provided to the cabinet members.
So as I said a couple of times in the briefing ahead of cabinet, we will provide our insight, our advice, our best advice and feedback in terms of how the flow might work and just ways of approaching different things. But that's really the extent of our involvement in preparation for the meeting, whether it be documents or information.
And again, I guess it's fair to say for that February 13th evening meeting, it's the Prime Minister who had the ultimate say over the agenda, the information that was provided, and the documents that were shared. Is that fair?
Yes.
And just my last few questions I have. We've heard about this assessment from CSIS, an assessment that ultimately concluded that the situation did not amount to threats to the security of Canada as set out in the CSIS Act. Was this a threat assessment provided to the cabinet members at the February 13th evening meeting with the full cabinet?
That's right, bitch.
I am not sure whether it was
think
part
the
of the
deputy
documents.
clerk answer, I think their testimony was
On this?
on this. They led that process, so I would refer to their testimony. I don't recall
Okay,
anything more
but-
than that.
But none of you know? Okay, what about an alternative threat assessment? A threat assessment that's different from the CSIS threat assessment. Was any such assessment provided to the cabinet members at that evening February 13th meeting with the entire cabinet?
So all of these assessments were provided to the incident response, the IRG, earlier that day, and then that was really rolled up and reported out to cabinet in the evening.
Okay, so, but the members of the IRG meeting, it's not the entire cabinet, right?
Correct.
And so I'm just asking about the actual, was there a document with a threat assessment that's different from the CSIS threat assessment? Was there a document that was shared at that February 13th evening meeting?
I can't speak to that.
And can either of the other two
I'd
of you?
refer back to the deputy clerks.
Okay. And we've heard about this legal opinion that was created that talked about how the definition of threats to the security of Canada in the CSIS Act has a different interpretation when applied to the Emergencies Act. I'm not asking about the content of that opinion. I just want to know, do you know if that legal opinion had been provided at that February 13th evening meeting with the entire cabinet?
Yeah. I'm not sure what we can say.
Yeah, I'm not sure what we can say on that. I think there's some cabinet confidence issues there.
So I don't see anyone objecting, and I think someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but the input that's provided to cabinet in terms of what information was provided is not covered by cabinet privilege. I'm not asking about what was discussed or the deliberations.
Right.
I just want to know if that legal opinion had been provided at that February 13th evening meeting with the entire cabinet.
And Commissioner, it's Brian Gover on behalf of the Government of Canada. The Government of Canada maintains the objection that you heard yesterday from Government Counsel then about solicitor-client privilege pertaining to the information provided by Attorney General, Minister of Justice Lametti.
Okay, so I think we're stuck on that.
And just so I'm clear, that objection means I can't ask whether that opinion had been provided during that meeting? Sorry, I can't see anyone.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for an answer on that
It's
position.
Brian Gover, you may not, consistent with maintaining the objection, inquire into the content of any advice given by the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
And the question is, does that include the fact of the opinion or not?
My friend may inquire as to whether an opinion was expressed. The fact of the opinion, not the content.
So to be clear, I was never asking about the content of the opinion. Was the fact of this, was this legal opinion, the fact that this legal opinion existed and whatever its content may have been, shared at that February 13th evening meeting with the full cabinet?
I'm not sure. From a document perspective, there were certainly discussions around it.
Okay, and the final question I have is, there was this Ottawa Police Service POU plan. Was that plan shared to the cabinet members at that February 13th evening meeting with the entire cabinet?
We had heard at various points in the lead up to the invocation that there were plans or action was about to be taken in various situations, including Ottawa. Absolutely, that was part of the discussion and consideration, the fact that action had not been taken up until that point. And the assessment was that was because law enforcement did not have the tools they needed.
Okay, but was that plan, the document, the plan, there's a document that's called the OPSPOU. Was that document shared with the February 13th cabinet members?
It's hard to comment because we don't have the document. I don't know.
I'm not sure what document that is.
Sure. I'm not sure how much time I have left, Commissioner Rouleau. I can just bring up the document just to ask them if this was something that was shared during that meeting.
You're over time, so if you want to put up the document, that'll be
Yeah, that's fine.
And just, I'm
so
not
it's-
sure they understand what it is. A POU plan is a public order unit, which are the police officers who go in on a police public order process.
So I can't speak to that specific, but Cabinet was definitely aware that on February 13th, when they were discussing, the situation in Ottawa was worse than it had been at any point. And the threats of violence, the actual violence was terrifying. That's what was discussed at Cabinet.
Okay, but you can't say whether a document had been shared during that meeting.
We still haven't.
And I just want to be
seen
fair to
that
the
document.
witness, sorry.
Sorry.
It's
Don't know what document.
PBNSC CAN 407734. That's the document. And I'll just ask them if this is something they've recognized and whether they know if it was shared. Just on that page. So I take it from shaking your head, no, we need an audible
That's not
answer.
familiar to
I've
me.
never seen this, no.
Okay, thank you very much. Those are all my questions.
Okay, next is the City of Ottawa, please.
Good evening. My name is Alyssa Tompkins. I'm counsel for the City of Ottawa. I just want to ask you a couple questions about some comments in the witness summary. So, Mr. Clerk, if we could bring up the witness summary, it's WTS, however many zeros, 83. And if we could go down to page 4, bottom of page 4. So I'll start by directing my questions to Mr. Clow because these comments are attributed to him, but obviously the others can add in. So there's a comment here, Mr. Clow noted that the city was clearly struggling to manage the occupation and that this was reflected in most conversations and media reporting and reaction from residents. So Mr. Clow, did you understand that the response to the protest was a police-led operation?
Absolutely, I understand that.
Okay, so you understand that the city cannot direct law enforcement as to operational matters?
When I said city there, I believe I would have meant the city holistically. So all of it, the sum of its parts. Clearly, the situation in Ottawa was out of control, and that's what I was referring to.
Okay, so in terms though of you understand it was managed by the police though?
Which reports into the city of Ottawa. I mean, all of this is the different levels are relevant here.
Okay, so the police, you understand there's a police services board that is independent from the city?
So I've answered the question. My comment was that the city of Ottawa was out of control, especially in the downtown.
Okay. Okay, I just wanted to be sure that you weren't suggesting the city itself could be doing more.
I'm not speaking to, I wasn't here, or am I now speaking to the specifics of the arrangement within the city of Ottawa?
Okay, and if we could just go to the next page, please. And again, it's you, Mr. Clow, referring to a meeting you had. And I think if we were to actually look at the footnote, I won't take you to it, but I think it's at February 3rd. And it's noted that one issue identified in the notes of this meeting was the fact that the request from Ottawa did not come from Ontario. And it was unclear whether provincial resources had first been exhausted. So this is prior to the letter from the mayor. So we're in the first week. And I just, Commissioner Lucky and Minister Blair have both testified that it's in fact very common for the city of Ottawa, for OPS to reach out to the RCMP directly because of Ottawa's status as the national capital. And I just want to make sure you don't have any evidence to contradict them, that this was actually quite a normal process at this point?
I don't have any evidence to that effect, and I stand by what appears here.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Okay, thank you. Next is the Ottawa Coalition, please.
Good evening. My name is Christine Johnson. I'm counsel for the Ottawa Coalition of Residents and Businesses. I want to ask you a few questions this evening about your experiences in Ottawa and also some of the experiences you were hearing of staff members that you work with in Ottawa. And I understand, Mr. Broadhead, that you live in Toronto and we're not here for the Ottawa protests. So I will direct my questions. Okay. So I will direct these questions to Ms. Telford and to Mr. Clow. So you were both here living in Ottawa during the demonstrations?
Yes.
And in the witness statement, and to save time, I don't think we need to pull it up unless I hear otherwise from you, but your colleague, Mr. Broadhurst, noted that at least some protesters engaged immediately in illegal activity by blocking and occupying city streets, defacing public property, harassing residents. Was this also your observation that this kind of illegal activity was occurring as early as the first weekend in Ottawa?
Yes.
Yes.
And Mr. Clerk, I will ask for you to pull up a document, ssm.can.00007737. And as this is coming up, I can advise that this is a set of text messages that we see at the top. It says Katie and JT. I presume this is text between you, Ms. Telford, and our Prime Minister. And I believe it doesn't show at the top of this document, but the way this document's labeled in our disclosure, our discovery database, it also says it involved Phil Prue, who I believe is the executive assistant or was the executive assistant to the Prime Minister.
Right.
And you've testified here tonight that Mr. Prue lives in Centertown?
Yes.
Yes. And we see here, you can see faintly at the top, these are texts shared on February 2nd. And it looks like, Ms. Telford, you share a tweet from City Councillor Catherine McKenney describing the situation in Centertown. And then we see this blue box below, and I'm not sure, do you recall if this was from Mr. Prue or was this from our Prime Minister?
That would be Phil Prue.
Okay. And he says, yep, the honking, wheel spinning went on late again last night. It was all day yesterday again. I put earplugs in at times during the day yesterday to make it less aggressive. It has already started again this morning. They have some periods of calm now, but then start nonstop for a period of time. It is enough to absolutely drive you absolutely nuts. The truck horns especially, they sound like they are right in the middle of your home. So would you agree that this statement seems to convey that for residents living in the heart of Centertown, the honking could be heard very loudly inside homes and not just on the street?
That's certainly what he was conveying.
And did you hear about this experience from other residents as well through your conversations with city councillors, citizens groups?
Yes, we were hearing it from local members of parliament, and they were hearing it from many of their constituents. We were hearing it from staff. We were hearing it from members of parliament who were in town. It was, and everyone was, from a staff perspective, was having to work from home during this period, or almost everyone was. So there were a few essential staff able to go in, but both because we couldn't access our offices because of the occupation, as well as Omicron, we were working virtually during this whole period.
Right. And on that point, I think I saw in the witness statement that there was actually a direction at some point that staff should work from home for their safety. And it was mentioned that this was never done before. It was never communicated that staff should work from home for their safety before. That was unusual and significant.
That's right. For a demonstration. Yeah. Staff had been advised to work from home during COVID pandemic at different periods, but for a demonstration, as far as we can recall, we've never had to send a notice like that saying stay away.
And in terms of safety concerns regarding staff, we saw in your witness statement, there was mention of a particular incident where a convoy participant threw coffee at a pregnant staff member. Do you recall that incident?
That's right.
And do you know if this incident was reported to police at all?
I'm not sure.
Are you aware that there were incidents of threatening and assaultive nature going on that were not, in fact, always reported to police at this time, and where they were, residents were not always receiving feedback that these complaints are being followed up on?
Yes.
Okay, those are all my questions for you this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next is the Ontario Provincial Police.
Good evening. It's Chris Diana, counsel to the OPP. And Commissioner, I can advise that I've been gifted 5 additional minutes from the Windsor Police Service, for which I'm very grateful. I may not need that time, but I appreciate the gift, and if I need it, I will use it.
Yeah, and if you don't use it, they don't get it back.
Won't be my concern at that point. I wanted to ask about Ipperwash. You mentioned Ipperwash in your witness summary, and as far as who answers this, it doesn't really matter, whoever has knowledge. I was going to bring up your witness summary, but I don't think that's necessary. You referenced that there was a verbal briefing. You said that in your evidence in chief. And I wanted to ask you about that verbal briefing. What did that come out of?
Why was there a verbal? What do you mean?
Yes.
So as I think I mentioned earlier today, it was actually something that I raised very early on in all of this, perhaps because I worked at Queen's Park once upon a time, but it was something I was just very conscious of and wanted to make sure we knew where all the lines exactly were. And the deputy clerk, who's a former deputy minister of justice, made sure to get us information on that.
Right. And the reason I wanted to ask was because, I mean, that's very preemptive of you, but were there any concerns that you had about comments that had been made by anybody at that time?
No, it was literally day one that I asked these questions.
And when you say day one, like the first day, the day of the arrival of the protesters approximately?
It might have even been just before. It was the very first meeting I was in talking about these kinds of things and hearing about potential, how the police were going to be handling things.
Were any members of cabinet asking you kind of how far can we go as far as police? Because understandably, there was some frustration that we've heard about police enforcement.
No, if anything, it was everyone was extraordinarily cautious on that front.
All right, Mr. Clerk, if you can bring up pb.can.1870. Mr. Cloud, these are some text messages I believe that you were involved with, so I'd like to ask you because I think you may have some specific knowledge. All right, and it's not entirely clear from the text themselves, although the description of the text in the database suggests that this may have been a text exchange with Chief of Staff Mike Jones, who I believe is the Chief of Staff for Minister Mendicino.
Yes,
Can you confirm
that's
that?
from Mike Jones to me.
Okay, and so I wanted to ask, and that's what I thought based on the content. So this is an email exchange you had, a text exchange with Mike Jones on February 6, 2:40. Do you remember this exchange?
I do, yes.
All right, and so Mike Jones writes, he expresses some concern about OPS enforcement and concern for the safety of the PM. I assume he's referencing the Prime Minister there?
Yes.
And he says he wants to go out and say that OPS needs to get control over the situation, and if they need more from OPP, they should make that clear, but they should get working on removals within the next 24 hours. Now, I take it that when he says he wants to go out, he's referring to Minister Mendicino. Is that correct?
I would assume so.
Do you know if Minister Mendicino or anybody else actually went to OPS with that kind of direction to try to remove people within the next 24 hours?
So first thing I'll say is these updates came in. There was a lot happening. There were a lot of conversations going on. So you'll note I didn't even have a chance to reply to this, or I didn't reply to it. But I would have received the update. My recollection is that did not happen, what is proposed here. And I don't want to read too much into the specifics of what is written here, but absolutely, as Katie said, we were always incredibly careful and aware that politicians don't direct the police.
Right. And when you say we were aware, are you talking about the Prime Minister's office, or are you talking about all of Cabinet?
Both. This was discussed and mentioned on various occasions throughout the convoy.
And is it because people were expressing concerns about police enforcement?
It was because this clearly policing was a central part of this. And a lot of us are aware of issues from the past. Everyone here is aware of Irnieracing, for example. So we were highly sensitive right out of the gate that politicians do not instruct the police.
Yes, and I would have asked, to be clear, I would have asked Minister Mendicino, but we didn't get this in time for me to do that, which is why I'm trying to understand from you whether or not Minister Mendicino or anybody else actually contacted anyone from Ottawa Police Service or even the RCMP to say, we want people gone, we want them gone quickly.
I have no knowledge of that.
Okay, but you would agree.
But I don't believe that happened, no.
Certainly, and it sounds like the Prime Minister's office was very aware of Irnieracing, which is great. And I'm sure you would agree that if that had been communicated to the police service, that would have been inappropriate, correct?
If what is written here is a faithful and accurate description of what it appears to be written here, I do agree direction should not be given to the police by politicians.
Right, and you would have no reason to doubt that, what his chief of staff was saying. You wouldn't have a reason to believe that wasn't what he was hearing from his own minister, correct?
I have no reason to believe that, but I can't and shouldn't speak to that. I do actually believe this text message was put to Minister Mendicino this week, but that really would be a question for him.
Do you know, when you talked about the briefing that was done on Irnieracing, were the ministers involved in that briefing? I mean, it sounds like there were a number of discussions, but Ms. Telford, you mentioned there was one briefing in particular at the beginning. Was that a cabinet briefing?
No, that was something we received on our request, but it was something reinforced on numerous occasions throughout the process.
And again, when you say we, I just want to make sure I drill down on who are we? Are they the politicians, their staff members? Kind of who is we?
So we, within Prime Minister's office, who are here, we were briefed early on our request, but then the principles were repeated on numerous occasions, certainly through IRGs and through other discussions throughout. I don't think there was anyone that I worked with who was not conscious of the need to be cautious.
Correct. Thank you.
And just to confirm, for the record, it was put to Minister Mendicino.
I apologize for repeating that.
It's okay. We all make mistakes. Counsel for former Chief Slowly, please.
Thank you, Commissioner. Panel, Tom Curry for the former Chief of the Ottawa Police Service, Chief Slowly. Just a few questions, if I can, please. These events have been described by probably everyone who has appeared here as unprecedented, and certainly in your collective tenure in the Prime Minister's office, that would be true.
Yes.
And the circumstances were also, I think Chief Slowly described the volatile nature of the events here in Ottawa, and you share that view?
Yes.
I think he may have described, or others have described, a tinderbox, risk of violence present always, it seemed, and growing.
Yes, and we saw it ourselves, as well as had it reported to us, the threat of violence both to people and property. It was significant throughout and escalating.
And although it may not have been clear at the outset of the demonstration and the protest, but as it evolved, did you come to understand that there were significant limitations on the ability of the Ottawa Police Service to manage it with its own resources?
It certainly seemed that way.
And were the briefings that you received always through RCMP officials? Briefings on police operations or updates, did they come from Commissioner Lucky?
Yes, though also the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, the NSIA, would have different parts to the briefs as well.
Understood. So just a couple of things if I can get, and I think they're Mr. Clow's notes. So could we please just get your help with a couple of things? This is for our registrar, SSM NSC CAN 2941, please. If that, yeah, thank you. Just on just a little larger, thank you. So this is just to situate you. Do you see February 3rd, 11:15?
Yes.
And you've looked at some of these notes previously that it says,
Yes.
Looks like OPS won't move, weeks, not days. Weekend reinforcements problem. Behind the scenes, too deferential, need, I think I want to just confirm this says need bad cop. You've got to use the tools you have, whether to change public message is different. Those are references. Do you know what those are references to? Is that a reference to the idea that at that time, at least someone was expressing the view that police were taking a standoffish position with the demonstrators?
I think that's a fair assessment of that comment.
And then just in the second one, it looks a second set of comments. It said, just as to this, RCMP, does it say through OPS under bus at caucus?
Yes.
Yes, it does.
How do we get right people on the path to driving somewhere? Any way to get, well, and you talked about that earlier. Is that, to the extent that you can recall this, is that an indication that the RCMP was pointing to OPS as the police of jurisdiction responsible for doing this and that they weren't taking sufficient action at that time? Or can you help us?
It was, that's me recounting from a national caucus meeting that, I believe that morning, where there was a presentation given to caucus members. The large part of the discussion was actually around personal security and security of the building. There were significant concerns for members of parliament being able to get from the airport to downtown, let alone from downtown up on the hill, and actually getting off the hill was a bigger problem than even getting on it. But also as part of that, it was discussed, or it was, caucus were told that if it had been up to anyone other than the OPS, that they would not have allowed the trucks onto Wellington, and that they had given that advice and it wasn't taken.
Right, all right. Did you learn at that time from anyone in that briefing from RCMP that some RCMP officials had seen and reviewed and approved the OPS plan in advance of the protest?
They did not get into that level of detail with caucus.
Okay. Could I ask you just to look, please, at page 7 of this record, Mr. Registrar, just for a couple of other things. Now, of course, I've got to pick it out where it was. About the middle of the page, you see there's a reference to, this is obviously a cabinet, it looks like it might be a cabinet committee briefing, but it says about the middle, 250 RCMP assisting, some holding back for surge. And there's reference to the Ambassador Bridge up above. Did you come to realize as this evolved that there was some misunderstanding about how many RCMP officers were made available to OPS at any given time, matter of shift counting and the like? Did you learn that?
There definitely appeared to be some confusion over several days about the numbers.
Right. I think the mayor of the city of Ottawa had said that what was represented as the number that had been deployed to Ottawa was smaller than the number that had been represented to the public and so on.
I believe he said that, yes.
And then just a couple of other lines, if I may. OPS, trying to reduce violence, are taking some steps. And then there's a likening to Ottawa's strategy to to D-Day. Is that a reference to the idea that there was a plan in place to try to dismantle the occupation, but that it was going to require significant additional resources?
It could be, but I don't know that. This was an update from the NSIA to the Prime Minister that Sunday evening on February 6th.
Right. And then, Mr. Commissioner, your indulgence for one more question with Mr. Clow's benefit, page 12, if you don't mind. Of course, you were following this as this page is coming up. You were following this across the country. These, as you've described, Ambassador Bridge and the like. If you look at, if you scroll down a little bit, Mr. Registrar, there we go. I just want your help with this. Brenda, of course, you've described as Commissioner Lucky. Certain references to RCMP. Ottawa team headed to Windsor, York, Waterloo, OPP. Plan is to remove by morning because auto workers counter protest. We've heard some evidence about that. Mayor wanted to remove chief, so then chief sent letters. Is that a reference to letters that were received by, I think, either the Prime Minister or Minister Blair requesting resources from RCMP? Do you recall that?
I'm not sure what that final line refers to, but this looks like a discussion of an update we received. This was February 10th at the IRG that Windsor action was anticipated the very next day.
Right. Thank you. And then the very last thing. On February 5th, Chief Slowly noted at a Police Services Board meeting that, quote, something has changed in our democratic fabric, and we do not have the legislation or the resources to manage such situations. We do not have the justice system framework or the needed coordination between all levels of government to predictably manage these demonstrations going forward. You described a threat to national security. Do you share those views?
Yes, largely, yes.
Thank you. No other questions for you. Thank you.
Okay, next is the City of Windsor.
Good evening, Graham Reader for the City of Windsor. We have no questions. We've ceded our time to the Government of Canada.
Okay. Government of Saskatchewan, please.
Good evening, panel. My name is Mike Morris, and I'm counsel for the Government of Saskatchewan. Mr. Broadhead, just at the outset, I want to make something clear. At the first ministers' meeting, Premier Moe expressed the view that the Emergencies Act was not wanted and not needed in Saskatchewan, correct?
I believe he also said the 6 items sounded reasonable.
Might maybe sounded reasonable, but wouldn't be perceived that way. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, yes.
And certainly did not want the act to apply to Saskatchewan, correct?
I think that was clear from the Premier, yes.
Okay, thank you. I'd like us to take a look at a document. So I'm going to ask the clerk to pull up SSM CAN 406920. And while we're waiting, I'll let you know that this is an email from Ms. Charette, Clerk of the Privy Council, to actually everyone on this panel at 8:24 a.m. on February 14th. So we can see there, 8:24 a.m. From Ms. Charette. Good morning, all. There's something that's privileged, but then she is detailing work that seems to be going on. Other products in train, FMM script with Q's and A's, comms, news release, and BG, which I expect means background. Decision note for PM. Then at the end, she says, others still in the machine. Mr. Broadhead, when she says others still in the machine, can we take that as they were being worked on at that time?
It's not a very common phrase. Like, I don't totally know what she was referring to here.
Well, she says only one I have seen is FMM script. And then she says others still in the machine. So I take it that means those are in progress. Would that be fair?
I don't really want to speculate on what the clerk of the Privy Council was thinking with that.
Okay. If if we could go on to a different document then, well, before we do, does anyone else have a view on that they're able to express?
Are you specifically asking others still in the machine or just
yes,
the whole statement?
Absolutely.
It could mean a number of things. I don't think we can speculate.
Okay. I'm going to ask the clerk to pull up the email that was referred to by Council for Alberta before. It's SSM CAN 402665. And this is the email thread that was entitled Presser Tomorrow. And I'd like us to go down to the bottom of the second page of the PDF. Right there is good. We can see an email from a person named Vanessa at the PMO to a number of other people, including others at the PMO, indicating presser tracking for 4 p.m. This is not to be shared publicly until FMM over and PM updated itinerary is available or is out, please. And her email there, of course, is at 11:05, I believe, if we just go up. 11:05 a.m. So my understanding is the First Minister's meeting would have been going on at that point. Ms. Telford, was the purpose in delaying the announcement of the press conference so that the premiers would not be offended?
No, there was a lot of work happening concurrently at the time, and to be ready for whatever scenarios and whatever decision ultimately the Prime Minister came to. And so Vanessa, who you named there, who's our excellent Deputy Director of Communications, was making sure that all those tracks were heading in the right direction. At any point, things could have been stopped and things could have changed just as they were.
Okay, I'd like us to go to the middle of the first page of this PDF, and it'll be an email at 1:43 p.m. There it is, from Vanessa again to David Taylor and others, stating, we just finished speech prep with PM. Alex is editing his remarks and will be able to share with this group as soon as he is done. So I gather at this point in time, 1:43 p.m. on the 14th, the Prime Minister has already rehearsed his speech that he's going to be giving at 4:30 p.m. Is that fair?
Speech prep is our shorthand for going through his remarks, which we would have definitely returned to again that afternoon. And so that means they would have done a once through with him on what things could look like.
Okay. He wasn't rehearsing two versions of a speech, was he? One where he was announcing the invocation of the Emergency Act and another where he wasn't. Was he?
To be clear, I wouldn't call it rehearsing. The words speech prep literally mean preparing a speech. And so they would have been discussing what would have been going into the content in it, whether he was comfortable with where the drafts were at this point.
Okay. We heard evidence from the clerk of the Privy Council some time ago, and her evidence was that the decision note was sent from the PCO to the PMO at 3:41 p.m. on February 14th. We can pull up a document if you need me to, or I can just ask you to take my word for it. And if that's the case, are you familiar with the decision note? I gather you've likely seen it before. Is that fair?
We're familiar with the decision note.
Okay. A fairly lengthy document with a number of appendices, correct?
Yes.
And if it was received at 3:41 p.m., do we know at what time it would have been returned with the Prime Minister's initials to the PCO?
It was at some point between receipt and when the Prime Minister made the announcement.
Okay, so it's obviously sometime before 4:30 in the afternoon then, correct? Mm-hmm. That would not have given the Prime Minister much, if any, time to have read all of that material. Would you agree with me?
Well, a couple of comments. One, he did read the note. Two, the start time of the press conference, it may be a bit absurd to dig in on the minutes, but the minutes are important here. I don't know that it started precisely at 4:30. I think there might have been some delay there. But after it was received, the Prime Minister did review the note, signed the note, made the announcement. And that signing of the note came after the FMM, came after the opposition leader consultation, and that was the Prime Minister making the decision there before he announced it.
Okay, I'm going to ask each of you a very similar question. Ms. Telford, what I'd like to know is when you found out that the Prime Minister would be announcing the invocation of the Emergencies Act at the 4:30 p.m. press conference.
He and I would have been discussing the possibility throughout the day. Until he signed the decision note, there was nothing confirmed.
Okay. Do we know when the announcement went out to the press gallery that the conference was going to be held at 4:30 p.m.?
I don't know what time that went out.
Mr. Clow?
I believe it went out earlier that afternoon, around or shortly after 1 o'clock. And the decision at that point to issue the itinerary was to notify media the Prime Minister would have something to say. And it is absolutely possible that the Prime Minister could have decided not to proceed down this path before he addressed the media that afternoon. And it happens not infrequently on an issue that scenarios are planned, a track may be on a certain track, but a different decision is taken at a certain point, even at the last minute. So no, the decision was not taken until shortly before it was announced to media.
Okay, I'll explore that just briefly if I can. Let's call the Emergencies Act Track 1, and let's call whatever the other decision could have been Track 2. Was there material prepared for a Track 2 presentation at 4:30 p.m.?
If a decision was taken not to invoke the Emergency Act on that day, the remarks and announcement would have been changed.
They would have been.
You're well over your time, so you're going to have to wrap up.
Last question, but was there any draft material prepared in the event that the decision was to not invoke the Emergencies Act?
I'm not sure if there was.
You would be familiar if there was, though, wouldn't you?
But my point is, even if there wasn't a draft, this can be done quite quickly in order to redraft materials. And it has happened before on different issues.
We got very nimble during the pandemic, where we were putting out advisories for things where we weren't sure what the content was going to be a couple of hours later. And that's what you need to do in times of crisis.
Yeah. I appreciate the entire panel answering my questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, now we go to the Government of Canada, please.
Thank you, Commissioner. And my name is Brian Gover. I'm one of the lawyers for the Government of Canada. And good evening, Ms. Telford, Mr. Clow, and Mr. Broadhead. By my count, Commissioner, I believe I have 20 minutes with the kind donation from the City of Windsor. I hope to be substantially less than that.
That'll probably be a happy event for a lot of people, but don't feel on my account.
Well, let's see how we do. First of all, the order in council sets out terms of reference directing the Commissioner to examine to the extent relevant, the impact, role, and sources of misinformation and disinformation, including the use of social media. And by misinformation, we understand that to mean unknowingly or unintentionally spreading false, inaccurate, or misleading information. We understand disinformation to be deliberately and intentionally spreading false, inaccurate, or misleading information. Ms. Telford, at any point during the convoy occupations and blockades, did you become aware of any misinformation or disinformation that was affecting the situation?
I became aware of a lot of both misinformation and disinformation over the course of the occupation and the blockades. To name just a few examples, even leading into the first weekend, one was that this was even solely a trucker protest, and let alone the fact that it was solely about federal vaccine mandates. It was quite clear from very early on, and even leading into the first weekend, we knew from the Canadian Truckers Alliance, as was mentioned earlier, and also from data that we had, that over 90% of truckers were vaccinated. We also knew that a lot of the mandates that were being talked about were ones that were actually responsibilities and put in place or imposed by provincial level governments or even other levels of governments or jurisdictions, whether they be school boards or cities. And then, of course, there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation around vaccines themselves. And then personally, in terms of our office, we dealt with a number of different instances. Our official photographer was drawn into a conspiracy theory, unfortunately, where he was being alleged to be out taking a picture of some hate-filled flags. And he, at the time, was actually in isolation with COVID himself. There was no chance he was doing that. We began trying to correct that. He began receiving death threats during that period. There was also a fake letter distributed amongst people within the occupation that was signed, allegedly. It was not signed by us, but it was signed using my name and the Prime Minister's name, and suggesting ways in which we might agree to some kind of, I don't even know what, but this fake letter was corrected and actually made international news. It was corrected on CNN at the time. And then I personally was actually asked to stay away for quite some time from the downtown core, because it started on Telegram and then moved on to other social media channels, a story that was created that I was going to create a false flag operation and have a horse killed and then blame it on the occupiers. So there were concerns for my security during that period as well.
And I understand, Commissioner, that the fake letter that has been alluded to by Ms. Telford can be found at pb.can.401821. And the false flag regarding Ms. Telford and the horse is in evidence as pb.can.00001822. Ms. Telford, how was misinformation and disinformation conveyed or distributed in the course of the weeks that we're concerned with here?
We saw it being conveyed and distributed in multiple different ways. The letter, for example, was, both screenshots of it floating around on social media, but it was actually being distributed in hard copy. And the other things, as I mentioned, were moving from different social media platforms from one to the other. But it was also, we were seeing people doing podcasts and YouTube videos and different things where they were disseminating this information as well.
Moving to my second area, Mr. Clow, you've testified in response to a question from Commission Counsel about communications with Juan Gonzalez, whom you described as a member of President Biden's national security team, on February 9th. And Commissioner, we have in evidence, and I won't take the witness to it, the text message at ssm.can.407744. And Mr. Clow, in addition to the text exchange, did you have a telephone call with Mr. Gonzalez that you recall?
I believe we did speak at one point.
And when was that in relation to February 9th?
I can't remember the precise date, but the first exchange, there was an email exchange, a text exchange with him on the 9th, and the interactions continued until about the 15th or 16th.
Thank you. The third area relates to federal, provincial, territorial consultations and the First Minister's meeting. And we have the readout at ssm.nsc.can 50625, and perhaps I'll ask our registrar to display that, please. And perhaps I'll ask if we could go to the second page. And you'll recall that my friend for the province of Alberta said that Premier Kenney was clear that the Emergencies Act was not required in Alberta and referred to the situation in Coots having been addressed. Can anyone on the panel assist me with this question? Do you know where the additional RCMP resources came from to address the situation in Coots, which we've heard was the subject of a police operation in the early morning hours of February 14th? Mr. Broadhead.
My understanding is that there was a contingent sent from British Columbia to assist at Coots.
And in fact, at the second page, we have Premier Horgan from British Columbia indicating that his only concern is that the measures would be implemented by RCMP and BC, which are already fully taxed. Not sure where you're going to find the people. We've already sent an RCMP contingent east. Is that what you're referring to in that respect, sir?
Yeah. And I would just add, what this illustrates is an example of something we heard from officials in the lead up to February 14th and the invocation, which was, yes, there was some progress in certain places and certain blockades, but the progress was done with the help of additional resources in certain cases. So in BC, for example, it was definitely concerning that Alberta was cleared with BC. Not concerning, it's good that Alberta progress was made with additional resources, but BC was facing its own problems. There were arrests at the Pacific Highway. There was a military style vehicle there when convoy activity happened in BC. So part of the concern across the country was there enough resources across the board to handle all of the pop-ups that were happening? And we were seeing an increasing numbers that weekend.
And Mr. Clow, in the course of your evidence already, you've referred to this phenomenon of stretching police resources. Is that correct?
Yes.
And this was in the context, this conversation, of declaring a public order emergency, which itself involves a national emergency. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, you were taken, by the way, to page 3 and what Premier Kenney said. And if my friend from Alberta said this, I didn't hear it, but she referred to, if we look down page 3, would be problematic to declare emergency today, and referred to what we see following the next point, starting with invoking what they see as martial law. What we didn't hear was what's in between two sentences. Folks at the core of this movement are not rational. They are prone to conspiracy theories. Have I read that correctly?
Yes.
And was that, to the best of your recollection, a feature of what Premier Kenney said during the First Minister's meeting?
Yes.
Can I add to that? Just the other one that I think struck me in his comments was this line at the bottom of the page that I don't quibble using the Emergencies Act, which is particularly interesting considering his previous roles with the federal government in that kind of national. And I think there, I certainly interpreted that as an important distinction between what he felt was needed in Alberta versus what we knew we were looking at from a national perspective and having to take into consideration the stretched resources, the movement, the differing situations across the country.
And Mr. Broadhead, to elaborate, if you would, when you refer to Premier Kenney's previous roles with the federal government, to what are you referring?
I believe he was Minister of National Defense in particular, so that was the one I was thinking of.
Right. And we're moving right along to the fourth area. Could we take that down, Mr. Registrar? And could we go to and display ssm.can.407721? And I come to this panel because I believe this was alluded to by my friend Mr. Miller on behalf of the Convoy organizers, and I really seek your assistance in interpreting what I understand to be a note written by Alex Jarek. First of all, I probably mispronounced his name, but did you know who that is?
Yes, he's part of the Issues Management Parliamentary Affairs team with a focus on Parliament.
And so a member of the PMO?
Yes.
And if we look at this, maybe we could scroll down just a couple of lines. Perfect, thank you. And we see something attributed to someone named Rayal. Do you see that, Mr. Clow?
Yes, that's Rael Lewis. He's the Chief of Staff to the Government House Leader.
And this says, confident we'll win those votes, need to do more in Senate to win that vote. Have I read that correctly?
That looks correct.
And how does that accord with your recollection of the discussion surrounding the pending Senate vote around the time when revocation of the declaration?
Sir, I'm going to object. He's misrepresenting the document. That document is in fact prior to the invocation, though it doesn't have a date on it. It talks about the announcement on the Monday, and it's quite clear that that record is in fact from prior to invocation, and it actually says in it that there's no violence under the CSIS Act.
I'm not sure what the date is. Is there a date on the document?
No, the DOJ never provided a date, unfortunately.
I'm just looking at it. So it's unclear what the date is, I guess, is what you're saying.
It does say that it's before a Monday where there's an announcement, and of course, that the announcement of the Emergencies Act was on a Monday, the 14th, on Valentine's Day.
If I may continue, Commissioner, what I'm endeavoring to do is to ask for the panel's interpretation of this so that we clarify these areas.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And if this continues, and this is a part that I believe Mr. Miller had referred to in his cross-examination earlier, or his commentary earlier. NES spoke with NSIA and Jody Thomas, and then there's an arrow. S2 of CSIS Act, violence not met. New arrow, wonder if need full 30 days if Ottawa cleared. Then speech Monday morning. Are you able to help us, Mr. Clow, understand the context of this? First of all, what does NES stand for?
So this whole page, reviewing it, this does look like it's well after, it could be a full week after the invocation of the Act. Clearly, they're talking about the parliamentary process. So the first part, Rael Lewis saying he's confident we'll win the votes, need to do more in the Senate. So I addressed that in an earlier question, that I know of no reason to believe the Senate was not going to endorse that. And as I said earlier, the Chief of Staff to the government leader in the Senate was doing vote counting, and I believe that evidence was presented here, and they were quite confident they would win that vote. The rest of the page looks like more parliamentary process and an individual caucus member.
Who is that individual caucus member?
Irnieracing Smith.
And whose view did you understand to be that Section 2 of the CSIS Act had not been met?
It's hard to say. I don't know what this refers to, but there was a public discussion going on about this very fact, as there is in this commission, but I don't know specifically what this refers to in this note.
Right. All right, well, we've done our best to interpret that, and thank you for that.
Sir, sorry, I'm given the dates.
Please.
Well, I understand, but we don't have a date for that document.
Yeah, and he gave his best evidence, and there's not much we can do. So please let council proceed.
Thank you. The second to last area has to do with the process that the three of you observed surrounding the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. And how would you describe the process surrounding the invocation of the Emergencies Act, the evolution of the thinking of the Government of Canada on that issue? Perhaps I'll ask you first, Ms. Telford.
I think the process was, it was we tried to be methodical about it. It was very step by step, and it was seeking advice every step of the way from multiple parts of government. It was taking in a lot of different inputs, and it was doing a lot of consultation throughout. And so actually even in processes that often go on much longer than this one could afford to, I would say this is actually one of the more robust processes I've seen.
Thank you. Mr. Clow, same question for you, your description of the process.
I would absolutely agree with that. I don't know that I have much to add other than, as has been covered at some length here today and at this commission, especially in those days leading up to the invocation from the IRG, and even before that, the steps that were taken were careful, considered, and there were a number of conversations involving a number of senior officials and ministers, ultimately leading to the cabinet meeting on the Sunday night. So to me, it was very methodical.
Thank you. And Mr. Broadhead.
The only thing I would add to what I obviously agree with my two colleagues, I think watching the incident response group, and I say this as a policy wonk and somebody who spends a lot of time with cabinet committees and these processes, it really helped facilitate the type of discussion. Having the experts, the civil servants, the key folks at the table, all the ministers there, that type of open discussion, it just meant we could move at a speed that the other institutions, the other parts of our apparatus don't allow. And so I think the combination of that and all the external advice we were getting, I think it was agree that it was a very kind of methodical process. And I think the Prime Minister was very clear about how methodical it needed to be, both before and after. So I'll leave it there.
And finally, our last question, and it's to you, Ms. Telford. If anyone were to suggest that the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act was politically motivated, what would you say to that?
It was absolutely not. It was driven at its core in every meeting the Prime Minister began and ended, and it was discussed throughout. How do we ensure the safety and security of Canadians? And there wasn't time, space, or desire to talk about anything else.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Okay, thank you. Any re-examination?
No re-examination, Commissioner.
Okay, well, thank you very much for for not sharing your thoughts, responding to questions, and coming to testify. Much appreciated, and it's appreciated that you accommodated the late hour. I'm sure it's not your first late nights, but it is appreciated. So I think we'll take a short break to move to the next witness, and we'll take to reorganize and so on. So we'll take 5 or 10 minutes for a break.
The Commission is in recess. The Commission est levé.
The potatoes are really so much flavor in them. Never had potatoes like that. next witnesses. That's so good. It's also potato, right?
I feel like drones are like cigarettes, like, you know, when people started smoking way back when.
They did.
You have to have them everywhere.
Hot mic. Oh, he said hot mic. For various times.
This public hearing will resume shortly, everybody. This is Marcel Ernie with Irnieracing News. Please bear with us. We have 10 minutes so everyone can take a break.